The snow was falling hard that morning, thick flakes drifting through shattered trees as a young American medic knelt beside a wounded man and listened for footsteps that could mean death. He didn't carry a rifle. He didn't have a grenade. All he had were bandages, a red cross on his helmet, and a plan that shouldn't have worked. But it did. It was late 1944, somewhere along the Western Front, and the fighting had turned forests into graveyards of broken branches, burned vehicles, and frozen bodies that lay half-buried in the snow. German units still held ground nearby, moving in small patrols through the dense woodland, confident that the Americans were stretched thin and bleeding badly after days of hard combat that had worn down both sides to the breaking point. For one U.S. infantry company, that confidence was deadly. They'd taken fire, lost men, and pulled back into a shallow defensive line while their wounded lay scattered ahead of them in the killing zone between the tree lines. One of those wounded men was still alive, his cries growing weaker with each passing minute. And a medic was going to reach him, no matter what it took. Before we continue, if stories like this keep you watching until the end, hit that subscribe button, because WW2 Vault brings you real moments like this every week. And this one only gets more unbelievable from here. What the German patrol didn't know was that the medic crawling through the snow had noticed something strange. Something that would turn fear into opportunity and bandages into a trap that would capture 14 enemy soldiers without a single shot being fired. He was in his early 20s, a former grocery clerk from a small town in Pennsylvania who joined the army to help people, not to kill them, and who still carried letters from his mother in his breast pocket. Like all combat medics, he carried a pistol strapped to his hip, but he hated the weight of it, hated the idea of using it, and had never once fired it in anger during his 6 months on the front lines. His job was simple on paper: move forward under fire, treat the wounded, and get them back alive if possible. In reality, it meant crawling into nightmares while bullets snapped overhead and shells shook the ground beneath him, while men screamed for their mothers and the smell of blood and cordite filled the air until you couldn't breathe without tasting death. That morning, a rifle squad had been caught by surprise fire near a narrow forest trail that wound between massive pine trees whose lower branches had been stripped away by artillery. 2 men went down immediately in the first burst of machine gun fire. One died where he fell, his body crumpled against a fallen log. The other lay groaning about 30 yards ahead of the American line, bleeding badly from his leg where a bullet had torn through his thigh and severed something important. Every time someone tried to reach him, German fire cracked through the trees from hidden positions, forcing them back with accurate bursts that showed the enemy knew exactly where they were and what they were trying to do. Waiting wasn't an option because the temperature was below freezing and the wounded man wouldn't last long in the cold, not with that much blood loss and shock setting in. The medic didn't wait for orders because he knew that orders would come too late and the wounded soldier would be dead by the time anyone made a decision. He wrapped a white cloth around his arm so it showed clearly against his dark uniform, adjusted the red cross on his helmet so it faced forward and caught the light, and started crawling through the snow that soaked through his sleeves within seconds. The cold bit into his hands as he pulled himself forward inch by inch, using fallen logs and shell holes for cover, stopping whenever he heard movement or the crack of a branch in the forest ahead. His heart hammered so hard he thought the Germans might hear it, and his breath came in short gasps that made white clouds in the frozen air. Halfway there, after what felt like an hour but was probably only 10 minutes, he realized something important that made his stomach clench with fear. The gunfire had stopped, not faded into the distance, not shifted to another position, stopped completely, as if someone had flipped a switch. That was wrong, and every instinct he had screamed at him to turn back. German patrols didn't stop watching wounded Americans out of kindness or mercy. They used moments like this to ambush rescue attempts, to draw out more targets, to turn one casualty into 3 or 4 by waiting for the medics and stretcher bearers to expose themselves. The silence meant they were watching, waiting in the trees with their rifles trained on the exact spot where he was crawling. Or worse, they were moving closer, surrounding the area, cutting off any chance of escape. As the medic reached the wounded soldier and pulled himself up beside the man's twisted body, he worked fast with hands that shook from cold and adrenaline, cutting away fabric with scissors from his medical kit, packing the wound with sulfur powder and gauze, tightening a tourniquet while whispering reassurance through chattering teeth that neither of them believed. The wounded soldier's face was white as the snow around them, his lips blue, his eyes wide with shock and pain. Then the medic saw them, and his heart stopped. 14 German soldiers stood up from behind trees and snowbanks where they'd been hiding, rifles pointed directly at him with steady hands and hard eyes that had seen too much death to hesitate now. For a moment that stretched into eternity, everything froze in place like a photograph. The medic's hands hovered over the bandage, blood on his fingers. The wounded man stopped breathing and stared with terror in his eyes. The Germans didn't fire, but they didn't lower their weapons either. They looked confused, and that confusion was the only reason the medic was still alive. And then the medic made a choice that would turn the entire situation upside down and prove that sometimes the bravest weapon isn't the one you carry but the one you refuse to use. He raised his hands slowly and stood with his knees shaking, keeping his movements calm and clear and non-threatening. He pointed to the wounded soldier, then to the red cross on his helmet, then back to the soldier again. He spoke in broken German he'd learned from a phrase card he carried in his pocket. Words he'd practiced but never thought he'd actually use, saying he was a medic and the man needed help and he wasn't armed except for the pistol he hadn't drawn. The German corporal in charge, a man in his 30s with a weathered face and tired eyes, hesitated. His finger stayed on the trigger, but he didn't pull it. Shooting a medic wasn't just a war crime that could get you hanged after the war. It was bad luck, bad form, against the rules that even enemies followed when they remembered they were human. And deep down, even in war, some rules still mattered to men who wanted to go home and look their families in the eye. The corporal lowered his rifle slightly and motioned with his free hand for his men to hold fire, and that single gesture bought the medic 5 more seconds of life. That's when the medic saw his opening, a chance so slim it shouldn't have worked but might be the only chance he'd ever get. He didn't run. He didn't beg. He didn't reach for his pistol or make any move that might trigger the nervous young soldiers whose fingers were tight on their triggers. Instead, he calmly told the German corporal in his broken, accented German that American troops were closing in from both sides through the forest, that artillery was already registered on this exact area and ready to fire, and that staying here would get everyone killed in the next few minutes when the shells started falling. He pointed back toward the American lines with confidence he didn't feel, then to the surrounding woods where he claimed more American soldiers were moving into position. He spoke slowly, confidently, like a man who knew something they didn't, like someone trying to save their lives instead of saving his own. The corporal hesitated again, his eyes scanning the trees around them, looking for movement or signs of the trap the medic was describing. The snow muffled the sound and made the forest feel both empty and threatening at the same time. Visibility was poor through the falling flakes. The Germans had been on patrol for hours and were cold, tired, and nervous about being caught in an ambush themselves. The medic added one more detail with a steady voice that didn't shake, telling them that American medics never worked alone in contested areas, that others were nearby with armed escorts, that he'd been sent ahead precisely because the Germans wouldn't shoot a medic. It wasn't true. None of it was true. He was alone except for the wounded man. But it sounded true, and in that moment, sounding true was more important than being true. Then he did something even bolder that made the moment hang on a knife's edge. He suggested they surrender, told them they'd be treated well as prisoners, fed and warm and alive, which was more than they could count on if they stayed in these frozen woods with American artillery about to rain down on their heads. For a long second that felt like a lifetime, nobody moved. Breath steamed in the cold air like ghosts. Fingers tightened on triggers. The wounded American whimpered softly, barely conscious. The medic stood there with nothing but a medical bag and a steady voice, holding the moment together by sheer nerve and a bluff so audacious it defied everything both sides had been taught about warfare. The corporal finally nodded, a single slow movement of his head. Slowly, cautiously, the German soldiers lowered their rifles one by one, each man watching the others to see who would break first. The corporal gave an order in German, and one by one, 14 men placed their weapons on the snow with metallic clicks that echoed in the silence. The medic directed them back toward the American lines with hand gestures and broken German, walking in front like a guide instead of a prisoner. His heart pounding so hard he thought it might give him away and reveal the lie he'd built from desperation and quick thinking. Behind him, the Germans followed in a loose column, still armed with grenades and sidearms they could have used, still dangerous, still capable of changing their minds at any moment. When they reached the US position after a walk that took 5 minutes but felt like 5 hours, American soldiers stared in absolute disbelief at what they were seeing. A medic, unarmed except for his medical kit, walked out of the trees followed by 14 armed enemy soldiers with their hands up, all captured without a single shot fired or a single drop of blood spilled. Someone laughed nervously. Someone swore in amazement. An officer stepped forward with his pistol drawn and took control of the situation, still trying to understand what he was seeing and how it was possible. Other soldiers rushed forward to secure the prisoners and retrieve their weapons from the snow where they'd been left behind. Only then did the medic allow himself to breathe, to let his hands shake, to feel the fear that he'd pushed down for the last 20 minutes. The wounded soldier survived after being evacuated to a field hospital where surgeons saved his leg and his life. The German patrol was sent to the rear for processing as prisoners of war, where they'd spend the rest of the conflict in camps that were cold but safe. And the medic went back to work the next day, because there were always more wounded men and never enough time or medics to save them all. Word of what he'd done spread quietly through the unit over the next few days, not as a legend or tall tale, but as one of those moments that reminded exhausted men why they kept going, why they still believed in something beyond the killing. Stories like this didn't make headlines in the newspapers back home. They didn't change maps or end battles or win medals. But they mattered more than medals ever could. They showed that courage didn't always come from pulling a trigger or throwing a grenade. Sometimes it came from standing still when every instinct screamed to run, from trusting your words more than your weapon, from believing that even your enemy might listen if you spoke to them like human beings instead of targets. The medic never asked for credit or recognition for what he'd done that day in the frozen forest. Like many men in World War II who did extraordinary things, he saw what he did as part of the job he'd volunteered for. Nothing special, nothing worth talking about. But years later, long after the war ended and the survivors went home to build normal lives, veterans from that unit would still talk about the day bandages became a weapon, and calm became the strongest force on the battlefield, stronger than rifles or grenades or artillery. War is remembered for its violence, its explosions, its death and destruction, and the maps that changed colors. But moments like this tell a deeper story, one about humanity surviving in places where it shouldn't, about ordinary people making impossible choices when the world collapses around them, about the thin line between enemies that can sometimes be crossed with nothing but courage and words. In the frozen woods of Europe, a young American medic who'd never wanted to kill anyone proved that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is refuse to fire. And sometimes the most powerful weapon you carry isn't the one on your hip, but the belief that even your enemy might listen, might choose life over death, might remember they're human too. Thanks for watching this story from WW2 Vault. If you want more true World War II moments that sound unbelievable but really happened, hit subscribe, because next time we're diving into another forgotten act of courage that changed everything.